Alas, poor Data. I knew him well, but then he died because his talents weren't very good. Since D&D 3.5, there's been a new thing in RPGs which has defined a lot of the special abilities that characters can activate. Where it used to be enumerated on a character's class or from their spells, there's this new idea called a feat, which is seen expression in Fantasy Flight Star Wars as talents, and now in Star Trek Adventures by the same name, talents. And while there isn't an ever ballooning pool of them on Star Trek Adventures character sheets, some talents are easier to find an application for and for them to be impactful within episodes, while others are very difficult to find the moment to use them, and then even once they are used, the amount of impact on the specific situation and the overall long-term reverberations once they've been used tend to be a little bit small. What I'm trying to say, folks, is that some talents are good and some talents are not so good. Now, I know that a lot of people like to choose options for their characters for flavor reasons, without deeply contemplating how good or effective those options are going to be.
Your objection is noted.
And sometimes there's a gulf between some players in a group and how they choose those options and others. It doesn't always have to do with power gaming versus role-playing. I like to choose things that have come at an opportunity cost for my character. He's chosen these things because they are his calling in life, and he believes that these things are impactful in the world that he lives in. In other words, in the game world's mechanics. And in other words, I do like to shop around and try and have an effective cachet of talents or feats for my characters, even when I'm playing with a role-playing or in-character focus. I know that there's other perspectives on this topic, and one of them is that it may be a game master's responsibility to recognize these sorts of divergences in character effectiveness, as some characters have an options package which leads them to really succeed very often and have a wide impact, while other characters struggle to have any impact. Now, in Star Trek Adventures, the base part of the character, the other 45% that comes from your focuses, your species, and your abilities and your disciplines, is very robust. And most characters tend to be fairly equal in that area. Depending upon the focus of the campaign, security can be a very good discipline, but generally, there are ways to use the super science technology of Star Trek to solve problems in many different ways. And so it may be that depending on how you look at these differences in character effectiveness as a game master, you may want to find opportunities for the real dogs of talents to have their day and find special circumstances where they may be able to save the day. One disclaimer moment before we start diversing these talents out into varying levels of effectiveness, aka tiers, is just to remind you that some of these talents, which can be really effective, just the right man for this very particular kind of job, are the sorts of things that you may want to use supporting characters to bring into your game. Supporting characters on their second activation can choose a talent, and this can be a great way to choose any talent out of the book on the spot as a scene begins if the crew really needs it. And this is something which happens on the shows. This doesn't really metagaming in the sense that we've seen LaSalle show up on the original series. We've seen Barkley show up at just the right time with just the right kind of expertise on TNG. And Elizabeth Cutler, she was around on Enterprise too. So that's something to keep in mind when it comes to talents. So how do we look at talents and know where they are on a ladder of goodness? What's a tier 1 talent versus a tier 3 talent? For me, there are 3 lenses that I look at talents, or feats more widely speaking, in order to see how effective they are. The first is how specific is the situation in which they come into play. There are talents that only work when you're doing an extended task for science or engineering. Meanwhile, there are talents that work anytime that you are assisting using command discipline, or even more widely speaking, anytime that you spend determination. Meanwhile, there are talents which only come into play in very niche circumstances. I'm looking at you, triage. And these are the sorts of things that come at the opportunity cost of the wider reaching and more easily activated talents. The next area to contemplate when it comes to talents is what are their impacts once they've been activated. So, a talent that has a wide reaching impact by either keeping threat down or boosting the momentum for other teammates will have an effect on scenes beyond the immediate task that they're in. In this way, a talent like Resolute, which just has a specific effect on one character's maximum stress, is not as wide reaching and as impactful as a talent like Diffuse the Tension, which can have a big impact by adding an extra bonus die and thus more momentum into a scene. The third area that I assess talents in is how many conditions are placed upon their use. This is different than how specific of a situation they need to be in. And what I mean by that is that a talent like Call to Action, which can grant other characters minor actions out of turn during your turn, is pretty easy to use anytime you are in combat. It is specific to combat, but you can use it on most of your turns. Meanwhile, a talent like Follow My Lead, which can be very effective in combat, is also one that requires that you use a point of determination. And technical expertise is useful in a wide variety of tasks, but they have to be actions where you're using the ship's assist die in order for it to come into play. Some of these constraints on activation are more severe than others. So, in order to look at the totality of a talent's value for the team, for the character, for the player character side of the game against the opposition, if you'd like to entertain that sort of notion, it's sort of multiplying these three areas of specificity, impact, and constraints. And the product of those three areas is the total sort of goodness of a talent. So without further ado, let's look at some tier 1 talents, and I'll explain to you how the interaction of those three qualities for these talents makes them really great talents for any character to have.
I believe the rules are understood by all.
Exhibit A, Veteran. What's its specificity? Well, anytime that you're attempting any kind of task, you can often spend determination. With the increased confidence that you'll recover those determination points, you can do it even more often than you normally would. Now, what is the impact of Veteran? Well, it's pretty high. With all those extra determination spends that you can make, there's going to be more momentum in the pool from successful tasks with more margin, less threat moving into the pool because you'll be able to succeed at tasks that you might not have otherwise been able to, or had to buy a lot of dice in order to make them happen. And there's also the potential that a lot of tasks could become easier for you and your allies, leading to more momentum generation from the Make It So spend, which is often more risky as far as its return on investment. And this talent makes that one more accessible. What are the conditions on Veteran? Well, the first one is that you have to be lucky enough to roll those effects on the challenge dice, having made a determination spend. So good luck is, in many respects, a condition for this talent. But I think that the impact after it does come into effect is pretty awesome indeed. The next condition is that your values need to apply to a situation in order to be able to spend determination. You need to take care not to be using challenge value all that often to regain determination, because those values will then be crossed out and not available to inform spends. So really the main condition for Veteran is that you build your values and your character thoughtfully in a way that you'll be able to make determination spends pretty frequently during the episode, and also have opportunities to regain determination with value complications which don't cross out a value. Since you can control your character's values, and even as you ascend the learning curve of writing effective values that can inform spends and also get complications to recover determination from, it's not a big condition in the same way as some of the other talents we're going to look at. So as we multiply specificity times impact times conditions, veteran is a winner. Here's another, in my opinion, tier 1 talent. It's called quick to action. How specific is it? Well, you gotta be in combat. Some kind of combat. Starship combat? Ground combat? Now, I like to think of combat situations in Star Trek to include the imminent threat that combat might occur, as in, oh no, we gotta get out of here right now. We are in danger. And so there's a lot of situations where this can come into play. Now, what's the impact? Well, retaining the initiative means that you can act and then an ally can act immediately without any enemy actions in between. This could get your team together to beam out. This could allow you to do a 1-2 punch, or simply to get out of line of sight and turn a combat encounter into a chase more readily. That's a pretty big impact when you think about it. Of course, this is something which you can do anyway, you and your team, but ignoring the cost altogether to retain the initiative is a huge savings in momentum. This means that the pool is going to be much more full, and that 1-2 punch that I just talked about is going to be that much more punchy because none of the momentum was lost retaining the initiative. So what are the conditions placed on this? Well, it has to be a combat situation, which means that the game master has to decide that it's combat, or your team has to be starting that combat, which is not always a Star Trek-like behavior. But take notice, it doesn't have to be your turn for this to work. In fact, it can be two of your allies retaining the initiative between each other. Neither of them might be you, as long as you're there. So this will allow you to take a turn immediately after your ally, just as much as it'll let an ally take their turn after you. So there's really not a lot of constraints upon this once you're in combat. So it's very impactful. I could imagine this saving up to 6 initiative or averting a combat altogether. Yeah, it's the first round of combat, but my experience of Star Trek Adventures combats is that they have a half-life of about 1.5 rounds. They often get over with in the first round. Here's another quality talent in the person of computer expertise. With this baby, you can throw an additional D20 anytime you're teaching a computer to do something. That's right, programming a computer, writing a subroutine to analyze the data. How about a bonus D20? Yes, this talent can be ridden a little too hard, and your game master might get a little bit irritated with it. But keep in mind that you're holding your tricorder and you are sitting down at computer consoles pretty often in Star Trek. You might say 100% of the time. So while you may not be programming or studying computers all of the time, there are very few scenes where you won't do it at all. And that extra D20 means a lot of impact. These tasks might not be all that hard, but with that bonus D20, there's going to be more momentum in the pool, more opportunities to just create an advantage on an incidental task that might have been something that would have blown past without a lot of impact. And that adds up to a pretty useful talent. What are the constraints? Well, you got to have a computer of some kind, or you have to be studying a computer. So I can imagine a situation where your character might be in a low-tech dungeon or the like, where this is going to be constrained out of the picture. Likewise, I can imagine there are a lot of situations, especially combat, where you can't program the computer and manual control is required of you. And that's a situation where it won't work. Thankfully, in Star Trek, combat is relatively rare relative to analysis and investigation and exploration. So that's what Tier 1 talents look like. They have many scenes where they can come into play. Their impact is pretty great, not only on the scene that they come into, but often down the road in the episode as the pools evolve. And finally, there's not a whole lot of constraints or preconditions on what you gotta have in addition to a situation that applies. Tier 2 talents often just have a little bit more restrictions on them, or they might be passive but good. So, an example of this might be something like constantly watching, where your ability to notice threats out there, something which is difficult to really do a proactive task for, but generates more momentum when it does come into play. Another example of a good talent might be jury rig or I know my ship for engineers. These can bring down the difficulty or add a bonus d20 when you are diagnosing or repairing your ship. And that's going to add more momentum to the pool and be impactful. But something does have to be broken. And in the case of I know my ship, you've got to be on your ship as opposed to elsewhere. So that's a constraint that's pulling down the overall impact of it. Tier 3 talents are nice, but their impact is starting to get a little bit less. They don't generate additional momentum dice or lower difficulties all on their own in the way that 1 and 2 talents did. So, Doctor's Orders, this is a great way to make a counselor character like Troy or Dr. Phlox have more impact in situations outside of sickbay because you're advising some people, and it's helpful. It is. Resolute, you got some extra stress on your character sheet, and that's great because in situations where the entire group is in a hostile environment and taking stress per turn or stress per interval, like every 5 minutes we take another 4 stress, that's going to mean that your character can be standing after his comrades are falling down. But keep in mind that most injuries are from taking 5 or more damage, not from going below 0 stress. So that's a kind of a constraint upon it, is that you have to be in circumstances where the enemies are so damaging that they're threatening to take you down in one hit to 0, or you're in a situation where the combats are dragging out for a very long time. Because, little reminder, you get all of your stress back at the end of scenes in Star Trek. There's also a lot of opportunities, even within combat scenes, to recover stress, either from first aid or from hunkering down behind a barrel of crates and just kind of pulling yourself together. And then there are the talents that just aren't so great, and we could call them tier 4 or even call them bad. I'm sure people are picking these because of flavor reasons, however, and let's just talk through what makes them problematic in terms of character effectiveness. Talent like triage is very specific. You have to be doing diagnosis. You have to be doing diagnosis on 1 or more patients. The impact is relatively low. You just get to diagnose more patients.
Useless.
And you could have had something as good as veteran or bold in the same place as that talent. Now, there are a couple of these talents that just aren't that great, but have a nice win more feeling to them, where they bring out some of the character's personality and it shows through. A little more power is fun because you're incidentally adding additional power to the ship, and that's great. But there are relatively few situations besides ship-to-ship combat where the ship is running low on power. Again, like stress, you recover all of the power when you start a new scene. So it's kind of not as impactful as it looks. There is one set of circumstances, which is when you're using shuttlecrafts, which have a very small power pool, where a little more power can really make using a shuttlecraft a lot more fun. And that's that's one of those kind of specific situations where if you are building a character that might have a small craft focus and you imagine that they're going to be the shuttle pilot for the ship, and perhaps the ship might do more shuttle missions, use shuttles when they can't use the transporters, the usual reasons, this character could be an interesting specialist, and that's a cool bailiwick for a helmsman character to get into in spite of it being an engineering talent. So what I mean to say when you're looking at these lower tier talents is, what are the constraints? Do you see them applying very often to your particular character? What are the situations as you're looking at the campaign? Would it be better for this sort of talent to be on a supporting character that is activated just when these kinds of situations come up? And can the impact really be as great and comparable as these other talents? Because it's really fun in Star Trek Adventures to be in a situation where your character is challenging themselves and really trying to get a hole in one in a Star Trek sense. You're trying to show and exhibit excellence, peak performance, you might call it.
Additional questions?
And that's why I think it's great to have more good talents and fewer dogs on your character sheet. So those are some analytical tools of mine for looking at what's a good option for your character to have, especially in Star Trek Adventures, and what are options which you're paying an opportunity cost in order to take those options. If you like this sort of video, if you like videos that I do, and you'd like to see more of them, then I'd love it if you would like and subscribe and help the channel grow so that we can have more reach and we can discuss games off the beaten path and also discuss games with a little bit more of a thoughtful eye, as I hope you agree we did in this video. So I hope you have a great holiday and have fun playing Star Trek Adventures.